Hello, everybody. So nice to see you here on our home turf in Sonoma County, right? Go team. All right, we've got such a great panel today, really fascinating speakers. So, Christian, where are you?
I'm right here.
Oh, there you are. Sorry, I didn't see you. Fabulous. All right, well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. And this session is not about convincing anyone that heritage matters, because every single person in this room already believes that. So what we would like to explore together this afternoon, which is perhaps, especially right now, even more important, which is how do we carry that forward? How do we communicate that heritage matters, and how do we keep it alive for the next generation? And thank you so much, Tegan, in particular, for teeing this topic up so perfectly. Great panel from all of the winemakers. Bob, Karen, Mark, thank you. That was fantastic, and great Zinfandels. And seriously, a perfect transition to this. So I'm joined by three remarkable people this afternoon, and including Marco Giordano, who's representing Vinchio Vaglio, a cooperative rooted in generational growing, of course, and a generation of growers who have built excellence as a shared inheritance. Also joined by Dr. Laura Catena, who almost needs no introduction, right, at this point. But, of course, Laura is a leading voice within our wine community today on a global basis. And in addition, her scientific work has really deepened our understanding of genetic diversity, specifically in Old Vine Malbec. So thank you so much for that. And then third, of course, here from California, my longtime colleague and friend, Christian Miller, who is, of course, with the Wine Market Council, as well as his own firm, Full Glass Research, and really spends his time digging in and helping us understand so many things about wine, and particularly today, digging in and understanding how heritage and authenticity resonate, and sometimes perhaps disconnect in the minds of today's consumers. So let's get started. And we're going to be moving through this conversation in four sections, four acts, if you will, starting with what perhaps matters most, which is from the heart of heritage, then moving through the tensions of progress across the chasm between what we believe and what others perceive, and then finally pulling it all together and exploring the question around what truly endures as we talk about our heritage wine. So digging in, let's get started. And I'd like to begin with this simple statement, which is one that really captures this bridge between cultural heritage and wine marketing and what we discuss. And it's really going to be driving the conversation that we're about to have. And in his book, Between the Vines, Terry Tees suggests that authenticity in wine really lives in these connections between family, soil, and culture. These are all things that most of us in this room experience perhaps every day. And today we're going to not merely celebrate those, but dig in a little bit deeper and ask how we collectively, as the global wine community, can cultivate those further, and how we keep them not only alive but relevant. So what I'd like to start with is how we dig deeper into that belief and what that means now and with our consumers today. So Laura, let's start with you. When you walk through your family vineyards, what connects you to the people that were there before you? Is it a sight? Is it a smell? Is it something perhaps more esoteric? But what drives that connection for you?
Wow, that's such a big question. Well, I often walk through the vineyard and start thinking of all these ideas of things I want to do to sell wine, which maybe is horrible, but we're talking here because there's like the birds singing and it's so beautiful. But, you know, a lot of people here have said, you know, talk straight to the young people. And I think that includes all people. I don't think young people are unique in wanting simple messages. And so I'm always thinking, well, this beauty here, all this, the sounds, the lack of pollution, everything, you know, the little fox that is running around there, how do you communicate that? And, you know, obviously I have this heritage, you know, dating back to Italy in 1902 when my great-grandfather from this vineyard, but, you know, I am now often thinking of how do I communicate this to people?
Marco, thank you, Laura. That's so true, and I think we all wrestle with some of these concepts. And Marco, often when I talk about marketing, I talk about how the best marketing is really just telling the truth, right? And telling the truth about what we feel and how we feel and what we experience with wines. So for you, what connects you personally to the land and to the vineyards that you're working with?
Well, first of all, thank you, everybody. And my father is the president of the cooperative, and so I born really nearby the cooperative. We started with in 1959 with 90 wine growers, and now we are 200 of families. So the first bond that I have with the company is I don't know what to say, that we have to think about all those 200 of families and those the things that they have done for the old vines and for connecting the vines to the people and to the consumers. Okay.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's so important. And I think for both of you, Laura and Marco, when you think about how we carry this forward and sharing with your future generations and also with future generations of consumers, what are the things that perhaps aren't written down that are important that we carry forward in our stories and that we share about the vineyards and the wines that you're making?
Well, you know, for me, you know, I trained as a doctor, so, you know, I trained as a doctor, and, you know, it seems easy to explain all this beauty and, you know, old vines, but it's not that easy. And so what I do is trial and error. I come up with something that I say, and then I see if people like it. Like Rosa and I just came up with, you know, if you pull out a vineyard when it's not ready, you know, that it's still young, it's an assassination. And, you know, Rosa really loved that. I'm using that from now on. You know, so to me, it's you love your place, but you know it so well. And then, you know, if you want to preserve it, you know, people need to buy your wine. And it can't be super cheap because making wine from old vines is not cheap. So, you know, I agree with what you said. Like, how do you communicate this beauty? And I think trial and error is a great method.
Well, we are really lucky because in our cooperative, in the last 10 years, we saw many wine growers that come back to take the labor that their grandfather do before them. Mm-hmm. So this is a bond to continue to speak with the new generation, to take back them into our vineyards. And I think it's some other people before told us that the younger generation are not so near to the wine market, but I don't think it's so true, because I see, especially in the last few years, especially in my winery, of course, we're seeing a lot of young people that come to visit our winery, and they're really interested in old vines and also in all the story, the cultural, the soil, the territory. And I think it should be the bond to take them back to our wineries, you know.
Yes, that telling that story.
I just want to add, Bob Bialy said something that was really interesting earlier, is that he loved the simplicity of presenting of old vines as a sales attribute, and I think that's very true. It's memorable. It's an easy way of categorizing things, and it connects quite easily with a lot of different memes, be it sustainability, whatever. Everyone's talking about how everyone's drinking less but better now. Well, nobody does less but better than old vines.
So true.
I love that.
Absolutely.
Feel free, use it, yes, not copyright. Yeah.
I love that. And I think that that really gets to the heart of what we're talking about,
Yeah, there we
right?
go.
Which is that emotional connection that is at the heart of how we share and tell this heritage story. So let's transition to the second phase of this, which is this paradox, right? In that we often say heritage gives great wine its soul, and it does. But we can also say that at times heritage and tradition can keep us in place if we're not careful. And heritage gives us legitimacy, but it can sometimes feel a little bit unmovable, whereas innovation brings energy. That, and at the same time, can make us feel unrooted because things are new. So the challenge for all of us, therefore, is to hold both and how we do that, and particularly as we're telling the stories around heritage vineyards and old vines. So to honor what grounds us while at the same time staying open to what's next. So let's put an idea out there on the table, which comes back to this whole notion around luxury. So if luxury used to be something that only a few people could have, perhaps now it's becoming something that only a few people can make. So, again, Laura, let's start with you, and then we'll come to Marco. So, Laura, in your world, craftsmanship shows up in a very unique way, right, in terms of genetics and biodiversity. So how does that enter into this conversation around luxury, scarcity, preciousness within wine? Does preserving genetic diversity make a wine more precious because it's rare? Or does it make it more authentic, something that connects us back to nature and the land? So I'd love your thoughts on this.
I have to interpret all those words, but yes. I have to say that when I first started to talk about science, we founded the Institute in 1995, and the first project was the 137 cuttings of Malbec, that nobody had done that for Malbec. And when I first started talking about science, we have an office in Buenos Aires and one in Mendoza. Mendoza is where we make the wine, and the Buenos Aires office was like, stop doing that. People think they're coming into a hospital with a white coat, and they don't want that with their wine. Wine is beautiful. It's not a hospital. And so it actually took us a long time to start talking about science. But then we came up with this phrase that is science to preserve nature and culture. And that's kind of my answer to what you're saying, which is that we are not doing science to do weird experiments. We are doing science because there's a crisis. We have climate change. We're losing genetic diversity. In Argentina, 90% of the vineyards are Masal, genetically diverse, heritage cuttings, and ungrafted. Nobody knows that. And all that is going to get lost if we can't figure out how to replant without virus. Another long topic. But back to your question, I think in terms of luxury, I didn't study economics a lot, but I took one class in college, and it was this supply and demand topic. Anything that's in low supply, if you can show that it's really good, will sell for more. And so I think that, a very genetically diverse vineyard is more rare, and we need to preserve that, not just because we need to, sell the wine, but because with climate change, that will be more important. So, I think in the end, I like what you said, which is, old vines represent, low supply, which if we use it correctly and we explain it correctly, we can, sell the wines for a higher price and that way not pull out the vineyards, which is our common goal.
So, Marco, let's look at this through your lens, with your cooperativo, right? Which represents generations of growers and people who've made excellence and preserving and continuing excellence, sort of a shared inheritance. So, can something that's made by many hands, as opposed to one set of hands, how does that fit into this whole picture of luxury and value?
Well, for us, I want to tell you something about innovation also. Because
okay, good.
For us, when we started in 1985 with our old vine project, preserve old vines was some kind of innovation, because at the time everybody were replanting the old vines for some more productive. So the idea was more quantity over quality. So we reversed this with some kind of innovation, and we started to protect the old vines, and it was also an innovation because we are 75% Barbera producers, and Barbera really need the old vines because in the last year climate change helped us a lot, but especially in the late 80s and the first of the 90s, we needed this stew production to give more to our wines. Barbera, as many probably know, is not like Barolo. So I don't want to say that it's a cheaper wine, but it's really hard for us to give more premiumization, to give a fair compensation to our wine growers. It's really hard to arrive to a fair price that gives them the opportunity to continue to raise their old vines and normal vines also. And with our vines, we started this process of premiumization, and we can reach enough to give enough to our wine growers. So it's really important for us.
Very good. Christian, I think this is some of what Marco is talking about in particular starts to bump up against some of the things that you've been thinking about and that you think about and look at quite frequently. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts in terms of sort of the implications and how we can change perception, or do we need to change perception on the part of consumers around this paradox between progress and heritage and luxury and perhaps non-luxury?
That's kind of I think you're putting a lot of weight on old vines to budge those kind of very large, more amorphous perceptions. Where I see the advantage of old vines is going back again to that simplicity. If it becomes a badge for certain attributes, because you can explain in detail all kinds of attributes dealing with sustainability, quality, complexity, etc. But that's a rather long conversation, good for direct-to-consumer sales at a winery or in a fine wine shop if you've got someone helping. But on the other hand, if you can put old vines on a label or on a shelf talker, if the case may be, or next to it on a list, and it comes to mean a collection of attributes, that's where old vines will succeed. And I think, to Marco's point, it's a perfect example of something that could be, if it catches on, a way of elevating the value of wines that have been otherwise kind of a bit commodified and have not had the good fortune of Barolo, for example. So
Yes.
that's where I see it. The value is in the simplicity, and we just got to get those attributes attached to it. And as I'll get to in a moment, the people who have been exposed to the messaging have got it. The people who have not, much less so, and we'll talk about that.
So we're going to get into your data in just a moment. And I'm wondering if you've also had any time spent around this whole notion of generational craft and generational craftsmanship and how that's tied in. If you have any comments to share in terms of consumer perception of that and the value.
I actually think that it stretches across, the value of craftsmanship it stretches across generations. It's just a question of whether the product that you're looking at is something that gets associated with craft. So the larger picture for the wine industry is to restore that association with craft and with as an agricultural product in its essence, as was talked about in several panels earlier. And old vines is one means of doing that, but just one. But that would certainly facilitate the success of old vine.
And I think with some of the points that we just heard in terms of the connection, that personal connection back to the land, the rootedness in the heart, that gives old vines this, as you said, a bit of an advantage in terms of telling that craftsmanship story.
Well, it's another thing that reminds people of the agricultural roots of wine, which is, there's a lot of talk about wine expanding into, wine cocktails, et cetera, all of which is good, all of which is a way to introduce people, all of which can help sell more wine. But wine's USP is its much closer association with a natural agricultural product versus other drink categories.
Absolutely. You know, I agree with that 1,000% in helping consumers choose a naturally grown and produced as opposed to a mass-produced, artificially flavored, potentially carbonated beverage, right? That's one of our big challenges that we are up against today. But let's transition against that, which brings us to the third category, which is what we believe versus what they see, and our role in helping to shift that. So we've talked a little bit about the heart, we've talked about the philosophy, but this between what we believe and what the world sees, there's often this chasm. And Christian, this is where your research really digs in and helps us understand this. So I'd like us to go a little bit further into that, right? Because even when the story is clear, and it feels clear to us in particular because we're close to it, it isn't always landing the way we think that it does with consumers. So in that gap between meaning and perception can often be where we land. So let's start with going through some of your research. Do you mind? Would you like me to?
Do you want to come up just so I can see the?
Absolutely. I know. I'm sorry that you can't see.
See what I'm talking about.
There we go. I'll trade.
All right. Yeah. Okay, so just a quick rundown on this research. Thanks to the generous donations of several resources, this was put together on very short notice for this conference. And first of all, the Old Vine Conference and the ZAP mailing lists were made available for us to send out survey invitations to. So that's a very interesting sample because it's part trade and part consumer, and also, but they've all been exposed intensively to Old Vine related messaging. So this is kind of your control of like, this is what it looks like to some extent when you've heard the story and it's been related to you directly. Also, thanks to John Gillespie at Wine Opinions, he enabled me to piggyback several questions on another survey he was running of his trade panel. The Wine Opinions trade panel consists of about 500 to 600 members of the U.S. wine trade, stretching all the way from importers and producers all the way down through, you've got SOMs, you've got store clerks, you've got store owners, you've got wholesale sales managers, all kinds of people in there, as well as members of the media and consultants and PR people. And then finally, the Wine Market Council contributed money for us to gather a sample of 317 core wine consumers who have not been exposed to the Old Vine messaging the way you might be if you were a member of ZAP, et cetera. So that's the three sources here. And then let's take a look first at the trade. And the first question we ask them is, while promoting a fine wine to your customers, and remind you, if you're in the wholesale, your customers are retail and restaurateurs. When promoting a fine wine to your customers, which of the following attributes do you consider to be indications of quality? They haven't been clued off yet that this is an Old Vine survey, and so this is what they answered. And what you can see there is that, the terroir or appellation is very important to the trade in terms of selling to their customers, and then also just the winery reputation or brand reputation, if you'll put it that way, is at the top. Old Vines did come in the second tier, however. You can see it's mixed in there with several other attributes. I've got a little problem reading my notes here, but you can see, historic vineyard, the estate produced or bottled, sustainable vineyard practices, and Old Vines are in that group. Interestingly, it came ahead of several other attributes that get kind of talked about in the wine press or critics' reviews or et cetera. Natural production processes, what kind of barrels you use, things like, use of wild yeasts or, low yields. All those came out below Old Vines. So that's where Old Vines are situated currently in terms of selling attributes in the wine trade. We also have, this is not moving along.
There we go.
Oh, okay. Yes, all right. We're on to the next one. We then presented them with a series of statements on Old Vines to see how they agreed with them. And you can see here, what's interesting is that I've separated out what you might call the Old Vine cognoscenti, which is people on the Old Vine Conference or ZAP mailing list, from the more general trade panel that the Wine Opinions operates. And their reactions are actually very similar. So I conclude from this that the trade is essentially, and this, granted, the Wine Opinions panel is tilted somewhat towards fine wine stores and so on because there are just more of them than there are of the chains. So if you're talking about, selling a wine at $12 at Safeway, you might get a different kind of response here. But really, the trade at large is sold on the concept of old vines, and they have very similar appreciations of the various attributes of them. Importers were more undecided on old vines being a useful selling point to their customers, but otherwise it was pretty ubiquitous. Now, a couple things I did want to point out here. The notion that old vine vineyards are really only relevant to fine wine specialists and connoisseurs and very highly engaged consumers. This was held by a fairly large number of a slight majority, about half of the trade. So there is some concern that this is kind of a niche thing. On the other hand, 1/3 did disagree, and that's a lot of potential outlets where they think old vines is potentially a selling point for even us, the regular folk. The other part of contention that was rather interesting is, whether the age of vines is important. And that's one place where the trade really is split about evenly between those who think, yes, we need a hard definition of age, versus those who think it's the principle that's far more important. What have we got here? Oh, yes, you might wonder, well, is the old vines just a ubiquitous term, or is it associated particularly with other particular wine varieties? We asked an open-ended question to the trade: what do you associate with the phrase old vines? Overwhelmingly, it turned out to be varieties were the biggest response, and especially Zinfandel, and after that, Garnacha or Grenache were highly associated with old vines. Some of the other varieties were mentioned by more than just a handful of people, but they generally trailed quite a bit behind. And interesting enough, when we asked them another question that I don't think is going to come up here, which of the following wines does having an old vines on the label really help sell? Again, it was the same thing: Zinfandel, Garnacha, Grenache, etc. Appellations trailed quite a bit behind, although Lodi and Barossa in particular came across as being highly associated with old vines. And in kind of a middle tier, a bunch of the Spanish appellations such as Priorato and Rioja and so on. So there is definitely a distinguishing factor right there. And then, well, I already summarized that, so I'll move on to the next one. Let's move on to consumers now. Now, what we did here, the very first thing we showed consumers was we didn't tell them anything about what we were serving about. We just showed them a picture of a vineyard. And half the people, randomly assigned, were shown a picture of a young, trellised, kind of modern-style vineyard. And half of them were showed the picture on the bottom, which was an old, I believe that's a dry, that might even be Saini vineyards, but it's an old Dry Creek vineyard, if I remember rightly. And with, the old gnarly classic vines. And we asked them, their opinions of, did they associate any of these attributes with this particular vineyard picture? And it's quite interesting because if you look at the results for people who've been exposed to communications about old vines, in other words, the mailing lists of the old vine consumers and of ZAP, you find very, very strong, statistically significant, even in this small sample, in different interpretations of the vineyards, and that the old vine vineyard was seen as higher in quality, more interesting, more likely to be a place I'd want to visit. People were able to identify clearly that that's an old vineyard, versus you look at the tiny percentage who thought that the trellised, more modern vineyard was an old vine vineyard. So you really did have very distinguished differences. Now let's go to the core consumers, who these are consumers who drink wine regularly, frequently, more than once a week or at least more often. About 1/3 to 40% of them buy wines over $20 on a regular basis. They're engaged consumers. They did not see the difference. So they do not have a mental picture of an old vine vineyard. And what my learning from this is basically that you need the story. It's funny, we always say a picture's worth 1,000 words. Well, in this case, some words change the meaning of the picture entirely, because their awareness of what the benefits or characteristics of old vine vineyards were when they were exposed to them in the ZAP and Old Vine conference sample. Those people who are not exposed to that don't interpret that vineyard image the same way. So it really is, I believe, a kind of mental framing and kind of emotional connection that's going to click for old vine vineyards with consumers. What have I got here? I don't even lost track of where I am in the space here. Sorry. Okay. Yeah. The interesting thing about this is after this, when they'd gone through a few exercises, and so they'd been exposed to the concept of old vines and people mentioning old vines, we then gave them a series of statements about old vineyards, attributes, and asked if they agreed or disagreed with them. And one of the interesting things is, although the ZAP and Old Vine sample had more positive associations with old vineyards, because they know a lot more, old vine vineyards, they know a lot more about them, what we saw was that still substantial numbers of the core consumers who hadn't really been exposed to old vine messaging, they still related to a lot of these concepts. You know, the fact that it might be of historic value or a cultural reason to, retain it. The idea that the wines may be more interesting or more flavorful or complex. You still had pretty high levels of agreement. So I think a lot of the attributes that we associate with old vine vineyards, these are highly plausible to consumers. They just haven't heard them yet. So it's really a matter of, kind of bundling the few best, most strongly registering attributes and getting them out there in social media, in tastings, in conventional media, etc. That's really going to be our way into their hearts. So this is only part of it. We're going to be sharing with Old Vines Conference and with ZAP sort of the complete results of these surveys, so they will become available at some point in the next couple of weeks when I can get myself a bit more organized. And with that, I'll turn it back to Honor.
Great. Thank you. So, Christian, I thought that was perfect. You provided all the data backing up what we've been talking about, right? That it isn't just the story, but it's that personal story.
Yes, everything you believe
is
true according to my data.
I always say that. It's that personal story, that connection back to the heart, and how we then position that and factor it in terms of this whole notion of progress and how we find that balance. And I loved what you said about the attributes that are associated with heritage, right? Are very positive and have that potential, but then how we weave those into our stories. And that's really where it all comes together. So I think teeing up the final section, so what endures? How do we tell the story in a meaningful way? And I think that's what's really critical within all of this. So, it's really that the real frontier here isn't necessarily the vineyard or the cellar, but it's this space between the perception and the reality and how consumers perceive that. So I'd love to hear sort of your closing thoughts in terms of how we can share what endures with our vineyards and convey it in a lasting, meaningful way in the stories that we tell, and the connections that you share with your wines, your vineyards, that all of us share with consumers. So, Christian, do you have
I would say I'm going to hark back to the notion of put it on the label. Put it on the label louder than you think you have. I do a lot of package testing in my other occupations, and consumers miss way more on a package than you might think. It has to be loud. Secondly, it's kind of a matter of associating a few of these key attributes with the old vines, and that's to some extent, going to depend on the audience. What's clicking with them in terms of are they oriented towards sustainability? I had an interesting conversation earlier about how there's actually a lot larger population in the U.S. of people who are wine drinkers and purchase organic produce or prefer organic or sustainably produced produce than do the same for wine, in part because they don't see the wines as visible or they just haven't thought about it much. So it's the same way, for that population, tying it into sustainability and aspects like that are more important. For other people, it'll be the whole agricultural connection, reminding people that this is something that comes from place and people with their heritage and is not monkeyed around with. You know, when you buy this, old vines, above all, when you're buying old vines, you're buying this place, and it's coming as directly, almost, the flavors are coming as directly as they can from this place to your palate. So they're like, and there are probably three or four other ways you could tie it. The folks in this room are much more diverse and have much more creativity than I would coming up with ideas, but that's the thrust of it.
Lara, you mentioned that you made the comment about people reacting, seeing you dressed in your white coat and being there at the vineyards in that intersection between science and wine. How do you weave your personal story in along with the scientific aspects?
Well, I mean, in the end, it's about authenticity. You need to tell a real story. We're doing research. We talk about the research. But I actually think that in the end, it's people, that other people care about. And, Marco's story, I remember reading his bio and thinking, wow, this is so cool, a cooperative. Because when I started my wine, Luca, Old Vines, in 1999, it was basically because a lot of these vineyards were being pulled because they were in a cooperative and they weren't getting paid enough. So I came up with paying by the hectare, and bottling this as a more expensive wine. And I've literally been talking about this since 1999, but until the Old Vine Conference appeared, nobody seemed to care about old vines. So I am so grateful to be here and for what you're doing, because now, actually, you go to a buyer. I mean, if you had done your study 5 years ago, it would have been totally different. And buyers actually really care. And I tell the Luca story, I talk about the growers, and they care. And a quick thing is, do everything. So I've written this book. I don't know how to write that well, but I wrote a book. I had an editor. I have a lot of followers on Instagram, and I hate Instagram, but you have to do it. Just do it. Do videos of the growers. Tell their stories, and be active, work all the time, and then maybe somebody like our Old Vines shows up and helps us.
That is the perfect example of that intersection between progress and heritage, and leveraging progress advancement in order to effectively share the story, that connection to heritage. And I think that that's essential. When we were chatting, Marco, you talked a little bit sort of about that same notion, about how advancement has helped protect your heritage with your cooperativo and how you tell your story. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. As I told before, we started in 1985 with our Old Vine project, and those give us the opportunity, as you say, to give a fair compensation for our wine growers, because in cooperative, of course, you share the good stuff and always also the bad stuff. So it's really hard to convince, in my position, all the 200 wine growers and all that families to follow the same goal, the same goal. So it was also harder to convince them to not replant the old vines, because it was easier to replant them and make more quantity, especially 20 years ago, 15 years ago, to sell the wines on the free market. But those who stay with us, and now I think I can say that we are probably one of the two best cooperative in Piedmont, probably the only in the Barbera area that almost sell in bottle all our wine. We used to sell old wine in bulk wine also.
Yes.
Because I say that we used to be like a boutique wine for the other labels come and buy our bulk wine to bottle under their labels. And now we are proud to sell all of our wines under our labels, and I think all our wine growers are proud of this, of course.
Bravo.
Fantastic. So making that story relevant, right? Which really is what brings us all together. So I think that what you just said is, it's about what the three of you said. It's about finding the language that tells the story, that helps people see and appreciate what's already here and the value of it. And that heritage, in fact, isn't preservation, it's participation, as you demonstrated so clearly. And it's that continuity of attention that's passed from one set of hands to the other. And so all of this, and I think where we landed is so nice, and Christian, were you going to make a final comment?
I was just going to say, I'm surprised no one asked me like, well, okay, well, does it help, if you put it on the label, does it help sell more? And the answer is to some extent, yes, based on this relatively small sample. What we found, we did ask the question, we gave it an A/B test of the same wine with and without an Old Vines designation. The wine setup was very positive, so almost everyone was at least mildly interested in purchasing it. But we did find that it moved a moderate but significant portion of people from the I'm somewhat interested to I'm strongly interested in that wine. And I want to say that Old Vines are never going to be a primary selling point. It's a secondary point. You still got the winery reputation, the appellation or varieties reputation. That's what's going to drive the initial purchase interest, and obviously the price point and so on. But it's a tiebreaker. I think someone alluded to that on an earlier panel. And the tiebreakers in the current market
are important.
We are flat or down. Just to be blunt, it's a competition for market share. And many, many people walk into a wine shop or into the grocery store and pick this wine looks good and this wine looks good, and they both look equally plausible. The one that has Old Vines on it for a certain number of people, that can be a tiebreaker, and that's a realistic purchasing situation.
Thank you, and I think that that's a perfect point to end on and to sort of wrap all of this, and that brings us back to this very core idea that if authenticity is our heritage, then it's relevance, and making that heritage relevant to our consumers, that's our responsibility. And how we do that as we go forward will help determine the future of our Old Vine vineyards and our Old Vine wines. So thank you so much, Laura, Marco, Christian, for sharing your thoughts and ideas.
Thank you.